everyone, my name is Fabiola, and this is the new podcast first episode. So today, we're going to talk about intersectionality, and we have a guest. Our first guest is Nathaniel Bacchus, also known as my husband.
What's going on, everybody? My name is Nathaniel, and I'm Fabiola's husband. I'm 30 years old, and I am a PE teacher. I teach grades from pre-K all the way to 8th grade.
Intersection definition by Reed says, intersectionality holds that the classical models of oppression within society, such as those based on race, ethnicity, gender, religion, nationality, sexual orientation, class, species, or disability, do not act independently of one another. Instead, these forms of oppression interlade, creating a system of oppression that reflects the intersection of multiple forms of discrimination. So why don't we start this podcast by laying out our own intersectionalities? So what's your gender, sex, race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, religion, disability, age, and whatsoever? Why don't you start, Nathaniel?
Okay, so I am a male. I'm white. I'm probably I would say middle class, heterosexual, religion, not really religious.
I'm a female. I consider myself as being biracial, but that's kind of like a blurry line for me. I'm Brazilian. I'm also heterosexual, and I'm Catholic. You know, I don't feel like my religion defines a lot about me, but still, I'm Catholic. And I'm 28. But where this comes from? The intersectionality theory was first coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. But it gained more traction with Patricia Hills when she reintroduced the idea in 1990s, when she talked about the Black feminism. I think it's pretty important to talk about the feminism movement that happened in 1960s and 1970s to understand how intersectionality works. That was a women's movement that did not include all women. You know, if we think about how the feminism movement excluded Black women, we see how intersectionality works. Have you ever thought how intersectionalities can completely change your career choices and that you couldn't follow like a career path because of your race, gender, sex, or class?
No, not really.
As for me, I've always wanted to be an actress, but I felt like my class prevented me to follow that career path. Just because, especially in Brazil, if you don't have money, if you don't come from money, it's kind of hard for you to be in a profession that, you know, makes you wait months and months until you land a job. But today we're going to focus mainly on how intersections affect one's career. Do you know that women are 50 to 70% less likely to complete a master's degree in STEM subjects than their male counterparts? We're going to start with Amina's story, research by Avramido. So Amina is a 35-year-old woman. She's a white Muslim, heterosexual. Her ethnic identity is Turkish, and she wears a hijab. Her family's working class, so she's a very like working class religious identity. Her parents are very conservative, very religious, but she always wanted to follow the science path since young age. When she decided to apply for the university, she couldn't study other subjects other than religion. The only way that she could go to university to study science is to have some deduction like points in her entrance examinations. So Amina faced discrimination again when she started attending the university because most of the professors, you know, they didn't actually respect her religion. And she said, I had to take my scarf off when entering university because it was forbidden. Some teachers would recognize this and say things deliberately to hurt us. At some point, she felt like she had to sacrifice her religion's identity to pursue her career. And she says, for most of my life, I was the only female student in the classroom. I always felt like a minority, an outsider. She eventually graduated from the university and then she moved to the United States to pursue a doctorate degree in physics. She always felt like she was the only female student in the classroom. After completing her doctorate degree, she moved back to Western Europe and she got a teaching position in a physics higher education organization. Throughout her career, she faced a lot of obstacles. The ones mentioned as her religion's identity always, kind of like being a blur. The fact that she was a female woman, in a highly male dominated career. And to add up to all of that she was an immigrant. Her family never really supported her. Her father, especially, he was not supportive of her decision. And she says, he advised me to stop, as a woman. He thought I should just find a job and be a mother. Her mom, she was kind of supportive, but at the same time, she was silent, as mostly women from, conservative religious families. People would usually say to her, I'm really shocked. How can you be both a physicist and Muslim? All physicists that I know are atheists. With this story, we see how Amina's multiple identities intersect. So, besides gender and ethnicity, social class is another factor that influence if a person will pursue a STEAM career or not. Amina was lucky to have win a bunch of different scholarships that helped her throughout her educational career. But that's not the case for many people. So I feel like from her story, there are so many things that people around Amina could have done differently. When we talk about education, and we have to think how intersectionality translate into educational practices. So you're a PE teacher. When you teach your students, have you ever feel like a methodology works better? Or have you ever felt like you had to use, you have to think about these intersectionalities that we mentioned when you're teaching your students?
Absolutely. In today's world, you have to be very careful with how you talk to children and the things that you are covering and the references you make. So, what I like to do is always make sure that I treat everyone like a blank page, as if they've never had any of the experiences that I may have had or experiences that I have not had. So, yeah, I mean, with kids, um, they're sponges. So, you have to make sure that you treat them with care and that when you're speaking to them, you aren't, referencing, for instance, if a student has a parent that might be incarcerated. So if we're playing a tag game, I'm like, all right, when you get tagged, you got to go to jail. All right. So using things like that, you can't do that because it might, affect them and make them think about all those times. Also, you come back from a spring break and you talk about, oh, I just, how many of you just went on vacation? For those kids who, don't have the money from their families to go on vacation. Um, and then also, your religion during Ramadan. If we're warming up and a kid, he can't work out because he's been fasting for 10 hours, and I have to be mindful that it's not because he doesn't want to do the warm up; it's because he's fasted. He doesn't have the energy to do that. So always being aware about the kids in your class and always trying to treat everyone as a blank slate. Not calling them boy or girl. I call them all friends, like good morning friends. Today we're going to do this because some kids, they're in eighth grade and they've decided to change their gender and identify as something. And I have to be aware of that. So there's a lot that goes into teaching. You have to think with a filter almost on your brain. And it really makes you think. And I believe that the best teachers, they work that into the curriculum and make it part of their personality when they walk through those school doors, that you have a bunch of kids that come from different backgrounds and they aren't, all experiencing the same things like you. So you have to make sure that you're all treating them, you know, similar, but at a very level where everyone is just, like I said, like it's a blank space. All right.
That's very interesting. And I feel like, parts of the Amina story, if the teachers were more inclusive, she wouldn't feel as lonely as she felt. This is great that that we talk a little bit about teaching, because this next part talks about grant studies, and he talks about preservist teacher. Preserving being like reflecting about what students actually need. And this brings us back to Amina's story, and how she felt excluded when teachers were mocking her because of her religion. From that, it's important for us to understand how individualism, meritocracy, color blindness, and white privilege works in a school settings. So, a longitudinal research by Milwaukee Public School indicates achievement scores are affected by ethnicity, social class, and gender. Noting differences in achievement usually appears after second grade, and they increase over time. Do you see any of that with your classes? Do you see like some of the students are way more prepared than others because of their ethnicity, their social class, or gender?
Absolutely. So my school is a public charter school, and it's in the heart of a part of New Orleans called Lakeview, which is probably a little more upper class, higher income area. And the kids that we pull from the neighborhood, you can tell that they're prepared. They have all the things they need, resources. But then we have kids who come from a different part of New Orleans. It's a little more lower socioeconomic. And when we get those students, they come on the bus. Sometimes they're late. They don't have food. And then, obviously, sometimes their test scores are a little different just because we have different backgrounds of these students and what their families have had access to. You can definitely see the difference. But the thing I love about school is that when you come together, everybody's treated the same, no matter what you are, where you come from or who your parents are or what they do. Um, I'm proud that my school treats everybody the same and that we can honor the values in hoping to make these kids, um, more successful than they were when they came in through the front doors.
That's great. It's great that you mentioned that, and it just talks about how the intersectionality affects students. What happens when we move that to a workplace? So, how intersectionality impacts your work. So, in Amina's story, we see that even though she's a doctor, she's not treated like such. We have this research by Jennifer Chan, George Lipzunk, and Young Shin. They talk about low paid manufacturing work by Asian immigrant women that works in the San Francisco Bay Area. This research is very interesting because they unite several women that are part of the same organization called Asian Immigrant Women Advocate. So Helen is one of the senior workers, and she immigrated from Hong Kong to the US in 1988. And at the time, she mentioned that she did not care about wages. She didn't care if she was being exploited or not. She just wanted to be able to provide for her family. And this is very interesting because not all immigrants are the same. And that's because intersectionalities. Non-white immigrants experience a greater earnings deficit because of their immigrant status than white immigrants do. And that immigrant women experience greater earnings disadvantages because of their nativity status than immigrant men do. So basically, if you take a Brazilian woman and a Brazilian man and you bring them to the United States, the Brazilian man is going to make more money than the Brazilian woman do because gender. Not only that, but Black African immigrant men earn less than Afro-Caribbean immigrant men, and about the same as Black US born men. So an immigrant from Africa will earn less than an immigrant from the Bahamas. And Black African immigrants earn less than white African immigrants. Again, race. This shows us how gender, immigrant status, and poverty are used to exacerbate labor exploitation. If we go back to the Asian immigrant women's advocate that I mentioned before with Helen's story, they believe that the same experiences with these intersections, of sexism, racism, class oppression, nativism, language discrimination, can help them solve some of the social problems. What AYWA did was they provided English class for these people. Most of these Asian women workers, they were college educated, but they didn't know how to speak English. And that was the first step. The other thing that they did was they gave them a community. So they take all these women with these very similar intersectionalities and they build a community where they could, talk about their experiences. They could bond and they could help each other. And there's another very interesting research that connects well with the experience of Asian immigrant women. And this research is done by Gina Neto. She talks about wage differences between immigrant women in Europe. And we can see that this is not a US problem. We can see how intersectionalities affect people all over the world. And unfortunately, women usually have the same problems all across the globe. So this research emphasizes the double standard that exists for women and how they always have to be involved with children, household, and low wages labor. Another thing that AIWA did was when they realized that all these women were being exploited, they decided to provide knowledge about workers' rights. But that was kind of like a double-edged sword for them because when this woman is starting to request minimum wage, they were fired the next day. So the organization realized that they shouldn't just give them the information, but also help them creating policies and social movements that would eventually help them, in like a bigger scale. So they created leadership positions within the organization. So all the women that had the same intersectionalities would work together and help each other. And this is interesting because we see the same problem in Europe. And being part of a minority there can be very hurtful. Sue, for example, she's a woman that works with two white men. And she always felt like she wasn't giving a lot of responsibilities that were part of her job profile. So one day she asked her manager, is it because I'm Black or is it because I'm female? So this is either sexism or racism. It's one of the two. You can see that there are less opportunities even when they're able to enter the workplace. And again, if you think about Amina's story, she was a doctor and she never felt like she belonged. We can see the same things happening with men that are white. Anthony, for example, he's a project manager from a sub-Saharan country, and he felt that he had been unfairly overlooked despite his experience and competence because the person who had been promoted instead of him had turned to him for advice when dealing with difficult situations. And Anthony says, I don't want to wave the ethnicity card all the time and say, because I'm ethnic minority, that's why this happened. I don't want to do that. Yet, at times, that's exactly how I feel. So the bottom line is that people face discrimination due to their intersectionalities. And when we think about privilege, we can see how intersectionalities also works as a magnifying effect for discrimination and for privilege. Have you ever felt like some of your intersectionalities helped you when you weren't supposed to help you?
Um, yeah, I mean everything that we've been talking about is just true, and as I am a white male middle income class. Like I was able to get into, they when you go to college and you apply for college, they want to see, where you went to high school and, what did your, but where are you from? And I feel like when you're getting those advantages of growing up in a place where, I mean, I grew up in a small shoreline town in Connecticut where, it's primarily like wealthy white families. And it feels like almost having just being from there, I had an upper hand on life from the start. And I was able to have access to a lot more different resources. And unfortunately, I was able to, be successful from that, not by the work that I had done, but just because of where I'm from and what I look like.
That is true. That's so true. And Stephanie Nid and Lena Gogjak, they talk about earnings inequalities at the intersections of gender, race, and activity. And when they talk about the magnifying effect, they say that privilege is structured in such a way that having privilege in one area, such as gender or race, produces additional privileges in others, such as nativity. And we mentioned before a white person from Africa and a black person from Africa, if they both immigrate to the United States, the white, immigrant from Africa would be more privileged than the black one. White men experience more privilege related to their gender than men of color. White African men experience more advantage from their immigrant status than black African men. White women experience less privilege related to their race than white men. And black African women experience less privilege from their immigrant status than a white African woman. So these findings suggest that the intersection of race and immigrant status operates very differently from women and men. We talked about education, we talked about workforce, but what about social life? How does intersectionalities impact people outside the education and the working sphere? This next research done by Along, Harden, and Judson talks about police brutality. When you think about police brutality, it's definitely a determinant of health. It causes mortality, morbidity, and disability. Racially minorities communities are disproportionately exposed to police brutality, significantly increasing mortality rates, elevating odds of physical and psychological problems. Black and other women and gender nonconforming people of color are significantly harmed. Police brutality becomes a tool for white supremacy. Being white protects you from the police. Have you ever had to deal with the police? Or have you ever been in a situation where the police should have been involved, but it wasn't?
Absolutely. I mean, growing up in the small little town, most of my friends, all of them were white. And, obviously being a teenager, we got into some stuff. But I mean, if the roles had been reversed and like if I hadn't been, of my race and, we're having a bonfire and somebody else's property, and we got caught and they just told us to leave. I think about like what would it be happen if it was me and my friends and we were all of a different race or in a different place. We definitely would have been treated differently.
Structural racism and structural sexism recognize that one, racism harms women of color like it does with men of color. Two, sexism harms women of color like it does white women. And three, how the racism and the sexism intersects. So intersectionality calls attention to how the needs and experiences of Black women are ignored by white feminist movement and by anti-racist movements that predominantly centered the experiences of Black men, underscoring that racism and sexism are linked and their influences in the life chances of Black women. And when we think about womanhood, it's usually perceived as white. Black woman, it's often dehumanized and perceived as outside of the category of being a woman. White woman is seen as pure, righteous, while Black women is portrayed as aggressive. Today, Black women and Latina women report higher rates of police brutality in the forms of physical police violence, physiological intimidation, and police neglect compared to non-Latina white women. Black and indigenous women have disproportionately greater risk of being killed at the hands of police, a rate more than twice than white women. We can talk about so many examples, such as Aina Stanley Jones, killed while she was sleeping in 2015 in Chicago, Breonna Taylor, murdered in her own apartment, Tarika Wilson and her 14-month-old son, shot by the police during a drug raid. Women of color has always been exploited, and the colonization showed us how indigenous and Black women were treated. They were frequently raped. They were often being hypersexualized. That they were promiscuous, they were available, they were aggressive. So women of color are more likely than any other group to be sexually harassed, assaulted, and raped by the police during searches and routine traffic and street stops. Latinas experience police sexual violence at much higher rates than non-Latina white women. Indigenous women and transgender women of color are also disproportionately victims of police sexual harassment, assault, and rape. Gender and race are not the only factors that matter for police brutality. Other factors such as socioeconomic status, disability also intersect to increase or reduce vulnerability. This was the podcast for today. Do you have any comments, Nathaniel?
No, I just think it's very important that if you did listen to this, you have a new way of thinking before you go out into the world and your assumptions and your judgment, and think about ways that either you've been affected by this positively or negatively. So thanks for, teaching me about this, and I'll definitely go out and try to, help eliminate these lines that cause all these problems for all these people in the world.
Yes, thank you, Nathaniel, again for being here. It's our first guest, and thank you all for listening. Today we cover how intersectionality affects people in workplace, education, and the overall society. This episode was sponsored by Fabi Bacchus, the new nail stamping page. Please follow if you're interested in nail designs. Even if you're not, just follow to help me. Leave any questions you might have to my plug page at Fabula UNO. Thank you, everybody. Bye.